On a cold and isolated night in 1852, far from the eyes of the wider world, a quiet Icelandic village lay sleeping under the shadow of a glacier that had stood unmoving for centuries. For generations, it had loomed over them like an ancient, frozen wall, a part of their landscape, a part of their lives, and something they believed they understood. Yet in one terrible moment, without a single sign of warning, that glacier awakened with a roar that echoed like thunder across the valleys. Entire families were swept away, homes crushed beneath ice and water, and survivors left whispering of unnatural shapes, of sounds that should not exist, and of a death that came not as a storm, but as something deliberate. This was not the kind of disaster people expected. In Iceland, nature was cruel but usually predictable. Volcanic eruptions announced themselves with tremors and smoke, floods with heavy rains, and storms with gathering winds. But what happened in 1852 was different. The glacier did not tremble before it broke. The skies did not darken. The earth gave no warning. Instead, it was as if the ice itself chose its moment, releasing a torrent of destruction in a way that defied understanding. The people who lived through it could not explain what they had seen. They could only describe the sensation of something alive within the ice, something that moved with intention. At the time, Iceland was a land caught between superstition and science. Folklore had long described Glacier as haunted, cursed, or even inhabited by ancient spirits that punished those who disrespected the land. But by the mid-19th century, scientific explanations for natural disasters were gaining ground. Priests and farmers told one story, scholars another. Yet in this case, neither religion nor science seemed to provide a satisfying answer. How could such destruction come without warning? How could a glacier, silent for centuries, suddenly unleash death as if guided by some unseen hand? Survivors spoke of more than just water and ice. Some recalled strange lights beneath the glacier in the days before it burst, as if the ice itself glowed from within. Others described sounds like whispers or voices, echoing at night, carried on the wind. Livestock grew restless, dogs refused to approach the glacier, and yet no one thought it meant danger. When the collapse came, it felt less like nature and more like something unnatural, something orchestrated. This is why the story of the 1852 glacier still lingers in Iceland's memory, not just as a natural disaster but as a supernatural event, one that blurred the line between science and myth. And while the glacier itself may have changed shape over the decades, its memory has not faded. Families still pass down tales of the night the ice came alive. Folklorists continue to debate whether the accounts were simply the product of fear, or whether they reveal something stranger, something humanity still does not understand about the frozen giants that dominate Iceland's landscape. Modern scientists suggest explanations: hidden volcanic activity beneath the ice, sudden pressure changes, or glacial flooding known as Jökulhlaups. But none of these theories completely account for the eerie silence before the disaster, nor the chilling details reported by those who survived. This story is more than just history. It is a mystery, one that forces us to confront how little we truly know about the forces of nature. Was the glacier of 1852 a freak event, a random collision of natural elements, or was there something deeper, something older, and perhaps even supernatural at work? Iceland, a land of fire and ice, has always existed at the edge of both science and legend. And in 1852, that boundary was shattered in the most horrifying way. As we explore this dark chapter of history, we must walk between two worlds: the factual world of geology and natural disasters, and the shadowed world of folklore, myth, and superstition. Because the truth of what happened in 1852 may not lie neatly in one or the other. Instead, it lives in the chilling overlap between them, in the whispers of survivors, in the haunting silence before the ice broke, and in the terrifying possibility that the glacier did not just collapse, it acted. This is the story of the glacier that killed without warning. A disturbing event that even today resists explanation, leaving behind only questions, legends, and the lingering fear that perhaps, under the right conditions, it could happen again. To understand the terror of what unfolded in 1852, we must first step into the world of 19th century Iceland, a land unlike any other. At the time, Iceland was still one of the most remote corners of Europe, sparsely populated, bound by ancient traditions, and constantly tested by the extremes of nature. The island was shaped by two primal forces, fire and ice. Volcanoes spewed smoke and molten rock with little warning, while glacier crept silently across the land, vast frozen fortresses that seemed eternal yet hid sudden dangers. For the people who lived there, survival was a daily negotiation with the unpredictable. Life in Iceland during this period was harsh, simple, and deeply connected to the rhythms of the natural world. Families survived through fishing, farming, and tending livestock, though the land itself often resisted them. The soil was thin and rocky, weather was brutal, and winters could drag on with unforgiving severity. A failed harvest could mean famine, and sickness often swept through isolated communities with little hope of medical relief. People built turf houses that blended into the earth, not only for warmth but also as a form of protection from the constant battering of wind and cold. Yet even in this struggle, the landscape was revered as much as it was feared. Every mountain, every glacier, every strange rock formation carried with it a sense of presence, as though the land itself was alive, watching, and capable of vengeance. Icelandic folklore was steeped in this worldview. The sagas, poems, and oral tales told of trolls hiding in the mountains, elves living in hills, and restless spirits haunting lonely stretches of land. Among the most ominous were the stories of Glacier, enormous, shifting bodies of ice that could both sustain and destroy. To the people of Iceland, Glacier were not lifeless ice sheets. They were forces, sometimes described as hungry, cursed, or even conscious. This way of thinking did not exist in isolation. By the mid-19th century, Iceland was experiencing a cultural shift. Enlightenment ideas from mainland Europe were beginning to trickle into the country, carried by scholars, priests, and travelers. Science was slowly replacing superstition in some communities. People learned about geology, volcanology, and meteorology, but these explanations could not erase centuries of belief. Instead, both ways of thinking existed side by side. A priest might preach about God's punishment through natural disasters, while a farmer would tell his children that the glacier had grown angry. A scholar might write of volcanic gases, while villagers whispered about restless spirits in the ice. It is important to remember that Iceland was not a wealthy nation in 1852. Poverty and isolation shaped much of daily life. There were no modern tools to predict or measure geological activity. No seismographs to detect tremors, no instruments to monitor the slow build of pressure beneath the earth, no way to map the hidden networks of rivers flowing under Glacier. What little knowledge existed was limited to observation and memory. If people noticed cracks in the ice or sudden floods in spring, they relied on their elders to interpret what it meant. Experience was the only teacher, and even then, nature often defied prediction. This lack of scientific certainty gave space for folklore to thrive. Glacier, with their sheer size and mystery, became perfect vessels for fear and imagination. Locals told stories of ice that swallowed travelers whole, of voices that echoed from deep within frozen caverns, and of shadows that moved across the ice even when no one was there. Some tales described the glacier as cursed tombs, holding the souls of the dead who had not found peace. Others claimed the glacier were home to giant spirits, beings older than mankind, who woke only when disturbed. These beliefs were not just stories to pass the time. They were warnings, guidelines for survival in a place where nature was always waiting to test human endurance. In 1852, Iceland was also living with the memory of earlier catastrophes. The Great Laki eruption of 1783 had devastated the island less than a century earlier, killing livestock, poisoning crops, and plunging the region into famine. Tens of thousands had died. Stories of ash-choked skies and rivers of molten rock were still passed down within families. These events were not ancient history. They were living memory, scars carved into the collective psyche. So when another disaster struck, people were quick to search for meaning beyond the physical. Was it divine punishment, a curse, or the restless spirit of the land itself? The village that lay beneath the glacier in 1852 lived with all of this context. To outsiders, it might seem like they were living on the edge of danger, surrounded by volcanoes and ice that could collapse at any moment. But to them, this was simply life. Generations had endured it, adapting to the rhythms of disaster and recovery. They respected the land, feared it, and yet relied on it completely. The glacier that towered above them was both a threat and a protector. Its waters fed rivers, its presence shaped the valleys, and its constant silence was a reassurance. And perhaps that is why the disaster was so devastating. There had been no warnings, no signs of restlessness. The glacier had seemed eternal, unmoving, and indifferent. To live so close to it was dangerous, yes, but it was also a part of the natural order. When it suddenly unleashed destruction, it did more than kill and destroy homes. It broke the trust that people had built with their environment. It forced them to confront not only their fragility but also the possibility that the land was not indifferent at all, that it was capable of choice, intention, and punishment. By the time the glacier struck in 1852, Iceland was already a place where science and myth blurred together. It was a land where priests quoted scripture while farmers prayed to be spared by spirits, and where scholars tried to measure forces that still felt beyond human comprehension. Against this backdrop, the disaster would not be seen as a random act of nature. It would be seen as something far darker, something that confirmed every story whispered around the hearth, that Glacier were alive, and that they could kill when they wished. The glacier at the center of the 1852 disaster was no ordinary sheet of ice. To those who lived in its shadow, it was both a landmark and a warning. It loomed above valleys where people farmed and raised livestock, a massive wall of frozen blue and white that seemed immovable, eternal, and inhuman in its scale. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful, the sunlight glinting off its surface like glass. But up close, the glacier revealed its true nature, deep cracks splitting its body, hidden caves of ice that swallowed sound, and a slow but constant shifting, as though it were breathing. Geographically, Iceland's glacier are among the most dramatic in the world. They cover mountaintops, feed rivers, and conceal volcanoes under their frozen skins. But the glacier that struck in 1852 had a darker reputation. Locals called it by a name that, when translated, carried ominous meaning, a name tied to death, hunger, or vengeance. To outsiders, it might have sounded poetic or exaggerated. To those who lived nearby, the name was not just symbolic. It was a warning passed down from generation to generation. Folklore had long surrounded this particular glacier. Some villagers spoke of the ice as if it were alive, a slow-moving creature that stretched its limbs across the valleys. They claimed it could hear when people spoke ill of it, and that those who mocked the glacier or disrespected the land would one day be taken. Children were warned never to wander too close to its edge, not only because of hidden crevasses but because the glacier listens. Others told stories of figures seen standing upon the ice at twilight, tall shadows that disappeared when approached. Shepherds swore that sometimes their sheep were lost not to wolves or cliffs, but to the ice itself, as if it had opened up and swallowed them whole. These stories might sound like superstition to modern ears, but in Icelandic tradition they carried deep weight. Glacier were not static. They advanced and retreated with the seasons, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. A farm that had been safe for decades might find itself threatened by creeping ice. For people with no modern science to explain these movements, the only logical conclusion was that the glacier chose when to advance and when to spare. It was not a mindless body of ice but a being with willpower. Adding to this mystique was the sound of the glacier itself. On quiet nights, people could hear the ice groaning, cracking, and shifting deep within its mass. The noises echoed through the valleys like thunder or low voices. Some described it as moaning, others as laughter. The glacier became a place of unease, not just for its size, but for its sounds, as if something trapped within the ice was trying to speak. Icelandic sagas and legends are filled with references to cursed places, restless spirits, and landscapes that carry memory. In these tales, Glacier often held the souls of the dead. One particularly persistent belief was that when someone died unavenged, or when they carried deep anger, their spirit might become bound to a glacier, wandering its surface, trapped in its body. These droga, restless dead, were said to appear as shadows on the ice, or even as faces visible within its frozen walls. To see such a face was considered an omen of disaster. And according to some accounts, villagers in 1852 claimed to have seen such shapes in the days before the glacier collapsed. Another belief linked Glacier with giants, enormous beings from Iceland's mythic past. These giants were said to slumber in the mountains, their bodies covered by snow and ice. A glacier, in this telling, was not merely frozen water but the skin of a giant, and when it moved, it was because the giant stirred. This idea blurred the line between myth and observation. After all, Glacier did move, though slowly. To people who lived their entire lives in their shadow, it was not unreasonable to imagine that something alive lay beneath. The glacier that would strike in 1852 had earned its reputation through more than just folklore. There were stories of earlier floods, of sudden shifts that destroyed grazing land, of hunters who disappeared and were never found. People remembered these events not as random accidents, but as evidence that the glacier took what it wanted. Fear and respect were intertwined. Families prayed when they passed near it, leaving offerings of food or whispered words of humility. It was safer to treat the glacier as a god than to dismiss it as mere ice. This blend of geography and myth created a unique atmosphere. To modern scientists, the glacier was a product of natural processes: compressed snow, layers of ice, pressure, and geothermal forces below. To the villagers, it was something more, a living monument of danger and mystery. Its sheer size and silence demanded reverence, while its unpredictability fueled terror. Every crack in the ice could be a warning. Every strange sound might be a voice. And every sudden movement confirmed what they already believed, that the glacier chose its victims. By 1852, the glacier had become so deeply rooted in local imagination that people no longer separated fact from legend. For them, the geography and the folklore were the same thing. The physical body of the glacier, towering, shifting, cracking, was inseparable from the spirit they believed lived within it. And when the disaster struck, it did not simply collapse like ice breaking apart. In their eyes, it fulfilled the legends. It came alive, moving not as a river or avalanche, but as a being with purpose, claiming lives with intent. This is why the event resonated so deeply. It was not just a natural catastrophe. It was the embodiment of every whispered story, every warning told by parents to children, every prayer offered to the mountains. The glacier of death had finally revealed itself, and in doing so, blurred the line between myth and reality so completely that even today, its true nature remains uncertain. The weeks leading up to the disaster of 1852 were eerily quiet. For a land as volatile as Iceland, silence itself could feel unnatural. Usually, the people were accustomed to signs that the earth was restless, the smell of sulfur carried on the wind, distant tremors that shook the ground, heavy rains that swelled rivers, or storms that lashed the coast. But before the glacier struck, there was none of this. The weather was calm, the sky unusually clear, and the air still. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen. Villagers went about their daily routines with no hint of what was to come. Farmers tended to their animals, children played in the fields, and families prepared for the coming winter. Yet, in hindsight, survivors would speak of subtle signs that were ignored or dismissed at the time. Strange phenomena that didn't fit into the ordinary rhythm of life, phenomena that now seem like omens. One of the first things noticed was the sound. At night, when the village fell silent and only the wind moved across the valleys, people reported hearing distant cracks echoing from the glacier. It wasn't unusual for ice to shift, but these sounds were different. They didn't resemble the usual groans of moving ice or the muffled thunder of avalanches. Instead, they came in sharp bursts, like voices raised in anger, then faded into a low rumble. Some compared it to the sound of distant drums, beating irregularly. Others said it sounded like murmurs, whispers carried through the ice. A few of the older villagers warned that the glacier was speaking, but their concerns were brushed aside. There were also reports of strange lights. Travelers passing near the glacier at dusk claimed to see a faint glow beneath its surface, as though something within was alive with fire. Some said it shimmered like greenish flames trapped under glass, others that it resembled lanterns moving slowly across the ice. At the time, these were dismissed as tricks of the setting sun or reflections of the northern lights. But those who saw them firsthand described a quality that felt unnatural, a glow that pulsed as though the glacier itself had a heartbeat. Animals seemed to sense something long before the people did. Sheep grazing near the edge of the glacier grew restless, refusing to linger as they usually did. Horses became skittish, turning their heads toward the ice and snorting as though something invisible moved nearby. Dogs barked through the night, pacing at the thresholds of their homes, refusing to settle. In traditional Icelandic belief, animals were often seen as sensitive to the spirit world, capable of detecting what humans could not. When livestock behaved strangely, people sometimes took it as a sign that unseen forces were at work. Yet in this case, the warnings were overlooked. Life was hard enough without pausing to interpret every oddity. Some villagers later remembered their dreams during those weeks. Several claimed to have dreamt of water rushing through their homes, or of faces staring at them from behind sheets of ice. Dreams, in Icelandic tradition, were often taken seriously, sometimes believed to carry messages from spirits or omens of future events. But when the dreams were shared, they were met with nervous laughter. Few wanted to admit that they were uneasy. After all, the glacier had been there for centuries without incident. Why should this year be any different? In the days before the disaster, the stillness became suffocating. The air was heavy, damp but without rain. Fishermen noted that the rivers ran strangely clear, as though something beneath the glacier had stopped feeding them. Hunters remarked on the absence of birds near the valley, an unnatural quiet that made the landscape feel abandoned. And yet, with no storm clouds, no tremors, and no visible danger, life continued as normal. Looking back, it is easy to see these signs as warnings, but at the time they blended into the background of a life already full of hardship. Icelanders were used to living on the edge of danger. The land was unpredictable, and oddities in the natural world were so common that they could not stop life every time one appeared. To halt work because of whispers in the ice or restless sheep would have seemed foolish. People ignored what their instincts and traditions hinted at, and in doing so, they stepped unknowingly into the path of disaster. This calm before the storm had its own psychological effect. Survivors later described the days as unnerving in their perfect stillness, like the world was waiting. One man recalled that he felt watched when walking past the glacier, though he could not say by what. A woman remembered an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional crack from within the ice. Children grew uneasy, clinging to their parents without reason. There was no violence, no storm, no earthquake, but there was a tension in the air that none could explain. And then, without further warning, that silence broke. The stillness that had lulled the villagers into a sense of safety shattered in an instant. The glacier, which had stood unmoving for centuries, roared to life like an awakened beast. The days of calm were revealed not as peace, but as the terrible pause before an eruption of violence. What came next would burn itself into the memory of Iceland, transforming folklore into lived experience, and reminding everyone that Glacier were not passive guardians of the land. They could kill. And sometimes, they chose to. It happened at night, when the world should have been at its quietest. The villagers slept under turf roofs, the air outside still and bitterly cold, the stars clear above the frozen landscape. There was no storm to announce what was coming, no tremors to warn of shifting ground, no rushing winds to carry whispers of danger. The silence broke suddenly, violently, as though the glacier had been holding back its fury for centuries and chose this moment to release it all at once. Survivors described the first sound as a roar unlike anything they had ever heard, deeper than thunder, longer than an avalanche, and so loud it seemed to shake the bones inside their bodies. Dogs howled in terror, cattle bellowed wildly, and within moments, houses shook as though struck by invisible fists. Some villagers woke instantly, startled by the vibration in the earth, while others were torn from their sleep by the cries of animals. Then came the breaking. The glacier did not simply collapse. It exploded. Massive walls of ice split apart, sending shards as tall as houses crashing into the valleys below. From within, a surge of water burst forth, black with sediment, carrying trees, boulders, and chunks of ice the size of ships. The villagers who saw it described it as a wall, not water, not ice, but a living wall, surging forward with unstoppable force. It moved faster than any flood they had ever known, devouring everything in its path. Families had no time to flee. Turf houses were ripped apart as though they were made of straw. Entire fields erased within seconds. One survivor described the sound of beams snapping like the breaking of bones. Another remembered the cries of his neighbors, swallowed almost instantly by the roar of water and ice. Those who tried to run found the ground already flooded, their feet sucked into mud as the wave overtook them. Others clung to anything they could, trees, rocks, even pieces of floating debris, only to be swept away moments later when another surge struck. What made this disaster so terrifying was not only its suddenness but its scale. Whether these were hallucinations brought on by shock or something beyond explanation, they reinforced the belief that the glacier had acted not by accident but by will. The people of 1852 would never forget that night. For them, it was not simply the collapse of ice and the flood of a river. It was an encounter with something vast, ancient, and incomprehensible. Something that killed not blindly, but with purpose. By morning, the full scale of the tragedy was clear. Entire families were gone, their homes erased as though they had never existed. Livestock drowned, fields ruined, and the very shape of the valley altered. The glacier that had stood as a silent neighbor for generations had revealed its power in the most devastating way. This was the night of the glacier's wrath, a night when the natural and the supernatural seemed to collide, when science could not offer comfort, and when survivors were left with the conviction that they had faced something more than ice and water. They had faced an enemy, and it had chosen to strike without warning. When the land finally stilled, and the last echoes of the roaring glacier had vanished into the night, those who remained alive began to grasp the scale of what had happened. In the eerie silence that followed, the voices of survivors emerged, not in unison, but in fragmented, trembling accounts of what they had seen, felt, and heard. These testimonies, preserved in parish records, letters, and later oral traditions, are as chilling as the event itself. They are not the voices of detached historians. They are the voices of men, women, and children who stood face to face with something they could not understand. One farmer, whose turf home had been torn apart within seconds, described waking to a sound that seemed to come from inside his own chest. He had felt the rumble before he heard it, a vibration in his bones that grew until it erupted into a deafening roar. He remembered leaping from his bed, only to see his walls splitting apart as if struck by invisible claws. He clutched his youngest child, screaming for the others, but the flood tore them from his grasp. When later asked what he remembered most, he did not speak of water or ice but of the silence that came after their cries. A young shepherd, barely 15 years old, had been tending sheep on higher ground. He was one of the few who saw the glacier burst from above, watching in stunned horror as an entire valley seemed to dissolve beneath a wall of water and ice. He would later tell priests that he saw faces in the ice, pale, human-like forms pressed against the surface, mouths open as though screaming, eyes wide in terror. When pressed, he swore these faces were not illusions of moonlight. They were the souls trapped within, he insisted, and that night they were set free. Another testimony came from a woman who had managed to climb onto the roof of her collapsing house as the flood struck. From that precarious perch, she clung to a broken beam and prayed, her body soaked and bruised by flying debris. She recalled seeing her neighbor's house lifted whole from its foundation, carried intact for several moments before shattering against a block of ice. She said she could hear singing in the distance, low, mournful, almost like a chant. It came not from survivors, but from the glacier itself. It was like the mountain sang as it killed, she later told officials, her voice trembling even years afterward. A fisherman, hardened by decades on rough seas, confessed to something he could barely bring himself to say aloud. He had survived by climbing onto a floating tree trunk and riding it until the waters subsided. Yet in the midst of his struggle, he claimed he saw something standing atop one of the larger ice blocks, tall, pale, and still, like a man carved from the glacier itself. It did not move, did not stumble, but glided along with the ice, watching him with hollow eyes. He never forgot the feeling that it wanted him alive, to bear witness, to tell others what had happened. The testimonies are filled with contradictions and impossibilities. Some survivors swore the ice glowed faintly in the night. Others claimed the glow was only the reflection of moonlight. Some insisted the voices they heard were cries of drowning neighbors. Others swore they were whispers from something older, darker, carried on the rushing water. One child even claimed to have seen hands reaching from the glacier, though no one could say whether this was the imagination of a traumatized mind or something more sinister. Priests, who attempted to collect these testimonies for parish records, faced a dilemma. They could not dismiss the supernatural claims outright, for they were too consistent, too widespread. Yet to accept them was to acknowledge a force outside both reason and faith. Some records attempt to strike a balance, noting the strange visions as hallucinations brought on by fear and exhaustion, while others quietly admit that the survivors spoke with conviction and without embellishment. These testimonies also reveal the psychological toll of the event. Survivors often described feeling not only grief for their loved ones but guilt for having lived when others perished. One man, whose entire family had been swept away, said he could not understand why he was left behind. The glacier chose who to take, he told the priest, and it left me with nothing but shame. This belief, that the glacier had acted with intention, would become a haunting theme in the years that followed. Even children, too young to fully comprehend what had happened, gave testimonies that disturbed their elders. A little girl told her grandmother that while clinging to a piece of driftwood, she saw a woman under the ice who reached up toward her. The girl insisted the woman smiled, though her eyes were hollow. Another boy spoke of hearing his dead brother calling to him long after the flood had passed. He searched among the debris, convinced he could still rescue him, but the body was never found. Over time, these survivor accounts became more than memories. They became warnings. Families who had lived through the disaster told their stories to children and grandchildren, not as history, but as cautionary tales. The glacier listens, they would say. The glacier remembers. To them, it was not a mindless mass of ice but a being capable of wrath, a force that punished without warning and without mercy. Historians who later examined these testimonies saw them as reflections of trauma. The strange visions and supernatural claims, they argued, were attempts to give meaning to a meaningless tragedy. When the natural world behaves in incomprehensible ways, the human mind often seeks patterns, turning chaos into intention, chance into punishment. Yet even the most skeptical could not deny that the testimonies shared striking similarities. Too many survivors described faces in the ice, voices in the dark, and a sense of being watched for it to be dismissed as coincidence. What is most unsettling is the emotion that threads through every account: awe. Survivors did not speak only of fear, grief, or anger. Many spoke of awe, of feeling small before a force so vast and so alien that it could not be fully human nor entirely natural. Whether they believed it was God's punishment, the work of demons, or the glacier itself coming alive, they agreed on one thing: they had been in the presence of something far greater than themselves. In their testimonies, the glacier was no longer simply ice and stone. It was an entity, a presence that killed without warning, watched without pity, and left behind not just physical devastation but a wound in the minds of those who lived through it. And in the years that followed, these survivors carried their stories like burdens, sharing them not to seek comfort, but to ensure that the memory of the glacier's wrath would never fade. In the days and weeks after the glacier's sudden collapse, the surviving communities of Iceland were left not only with destruction, but with a question that haunted them more deeply than the loss itself. Why had this happened? For a people who lived close to the land, whose survival depended on an intimate relationship with nature, this event could not be dismissed as random. It had to mean something. And so the survivors, priests, and storytellers turned to religion and the supernatural for explanations that could make sense of the chaos. For many, the most immediate interpretation was divine punishment. In 19th century Iceland, the Lutheran Church was not only a source of faith but also the foundation of law, morality, and community. Natural disasters were often framed as signs of God's displeasure. Priests in their Sunday sermons warned that the glacier's fury was not an accident but a message, a chastisement for hidden sins among the people. Entire congregations were told to search their hearts, to repent of pride, greed, and unfaithfulness. Some believed the tragedy was punishment for abandoning old traditions of humility before nature, for taking the land for granted instead of respecting it as God's creation. Yet the testimonies of survivors complicated this interpretation. They had seen things that did not fit easily into biblical language. Faces in the ice, voices calling from the dark, a sense of something watching. These visions suggested not just divine wrath, but the presence of something far older, something beyond the reach of Christian scripture. And so whispers began to circulate of pagan echoes, remnants of Iceland's ancient belief in land spirits, giants, and elemental forces. In Norse tradition, glacier were not merely frozen rivers. They were living entities tied to the Jotun, the frost giants, beings of ice and stone who warred with the gods in myths older than Christianity's arrival in the north. Though Iceland had been Christian for centuries by 1852, these old beliefs never fully disappeared. In farmhouses lit by dim oil lamps, old stories were repeated, that glacier carried souls within them, that the ice was the body of ancient beings who slept beneath the mountains, and that when provoked, they could awaken. The events of that night seemed to confirm these legends. To those who lost family, the disaster felt less like nature's accident and more like a giant rising in anger. Some interpreted the tragedy as the vengeance of the Landvedi, the guardian spirits of Icelandic land and water. According to folklore, these spirits protected the land from harm, but they demanded respect. Cutting sacred trees, polluting rivers, or disturbing old burial mounds could anger them. Stories spread that someone in the valley had unknowingly broken such a taboo, awakening the spirit's fury. The glacier's sudden violence was, in this view, less a natural event and more a spiritual retaliation. Among the survivors, there were also those who pointed to the devil. The pale figure one fisherman claimed to have seen gliding atop the ice was interpreted by some as a demonic presence, guiding the destruction. Priests recorded rumors that the glacier had become an instrument of hell, its waters carrying souls not to heaven but to damnation. This interpretation resonated deeply with villagers who had lost children and could not reconcile their deaths with the idea of a merciful God. If this is God's will, one grieving mother was reported to have said, then God has abandoned us. What makes these interpretations especially haunting is how they mixed and overlapped. Some villagers spoke of both God's punishment and the glacier's own spirit. Others claimed the two were not separate at all, that the glacier was God's instrument, a physical embodiment of his wrath. Still others clung to the pagan belief that the old giants were stirring once again beneath Iceland's frozen heart. In this way, the disaster became not only a natural calamity but a battlefield of explanations, each belief trying to impose order on what seemed like chaos. As weeks turned into months, the stories hardened into warnings. Parents told their children not to mock the mountains, not to speak lightly of Glacier, not to build homes too close to their edges. Priests warned of sin, elders warned of angered spirits, and storytellers whispered of faces trapped in ice. Every version carried the same lesson: respect the power of the glacier, for it is more than frozen water, it is a presence, and it remembers. What stands out when reading these accounts today is how blurred the line became between religion and folklore. Christianity provided a framework of sin and divine judgment, but the raw imagery of the disaster revived memories of older, darker beliefs. Survivors seemed unwilling, or unable, to see the event as purely natural. To them, the glacier had acted with intention. It was not weather. It was not chance. It was something alive, something that chose to kill without warning. Modern historians might dismiss these interpretations as the inevitable product of trauma and limited scientific understanding. Yet even now, there is something haunting in the consistency of the survivors' visions. Faces in ice. Whispers in the flood. The feeling of being watched. Whether these were hallucinations, dreams, or the mind's desperate attempt to shape terror into meaning, they carried a power that logic could not erase. And for the people of 1852, those meanings mattered more than geology. By turning to religion and the supernatural, the survivors found a way to live with what had happened, even if it meant seeing the glacier not as a lifeless mass of frozen water, but as an ancient being with will and wrath. And in doing so, they passed down not just stories of loss, but an enduring legacy of fear, a reminder that some parts of nature are not merely dangerous, but uncanny. By the mid-19th century, Iceland was no longer a land where every event was explained purely through faith or folklore. Across Europe, new sciences were emerging, and natural philosophy was transforming into what we now call geology. Scholars were beginning to study the Earth not as a mystical creation, but as a machine of processes, shaped by forces that could be measured, categorized, and explained. Yet when word of the glacier's collapse in 1852 spread beyond the valleys, it presented a disturbing challenge. How could science account for such sudden and devastating destruction, especially when the survivors' stories carried such uncanny detail? Scientists and naturalists who heard of the event were initially cautious. Many had never set foot in Iceland, relying instead on travelers' reports, letters, and the few Icelandic scholars who documented the catastrophe. The first explanation centered on the idea of a Jökulhlaup, a glacial outburst flood. This phenomenon, known today but poorly understood at the time, occurs when volcanic heat or underground geothermal activity melts ice beneath a glacier, building up massive reservoirs of water that can burst forth with little warning. To scientists, this seemed a plausible explanation. Iceland sat on one of the most volcanically active regions on Earth, where fire and ice coexisted uneasily. But the details of the event strained even this theory. Reports of glowing ice, of massive blocks moving with uncanny coordination, of sounds like chanting or singing, all of this seemed to resist geological language. Scholars dismissed these aspects as exaggerations, the product of terrified imaginations. The mind, overwhelmed by terror, clothes natural events in the garb of the supernatural, one Danish geologist wrote, attempting to reduce the villagers' visions to mere psychology. Yet the sheer consistency of these accounts nagged at others. Could mass trauma really explain why dozens of survivors, separated by distance, described faces appearing in the rolling ice? Another hypothesis suggested that the collapse was linked not only to geothermal activity but to internal pressure within the glacier itself. Scientists proposed that as meltwater accumulated within the ice, it eventually found release through a sudden fracture, like a dam bursting. This would explain the explosive force and the walls of water reported. Yet these explanations still did not account for the silence before the event. Normally, one might expect rumbling, cracking, or tremors to warn of impending collapse. But survivors insisted there had been nothing, just calm, then catastrophe. Some early observers even considered whether gases trapped within the glacier could have played a role. Icelandic hot springs were known to emit sulfurous vapors, and some theorized that chemical reactions beneath the ice might have caused an explosive release. But this theory never held, as there was little physical evidence beyond mud, debris, and ruin. The mystery remained stubborn. What made the scientists' task harder was the scarcity of physical evidence. By the time scholars arrived at the site, the glacier had stilled again. The water had drained away, the ice lay quiet, and the valley bore only scars, mud-choked fields, shattered homes, and broken lives. There were no instruments to measure seismic activity, no photographs to capture the collapse, no modern tools to map the hidden waterways within the glacier. All that remained were the testimonies of survivors, which scientists regarded as unreliable. This left them in a paradox. The only direct witnesses were those whom they distrusted most. Yet despite their skepticism, some geologists admitted to a sense of awe when they stood before the glacier. Its sheer scale, its silent bulk pressing into the valley, seemed almost menacing. One Danish naturalist described it in his field notes as a frozen beast, crouched and waiting. He insisted that while the disaster could be explained by natural processes, the impression it leaves on the human heart is one of dread, as though the glacier itself is alive. These words reveal an uneasy boundary between scientific detachment and human instinct. The scientific debates also highlighted a cultural divide. For villagers, the glacier's wrath was personal, intentional. For scientists, it was impersonal, mechanical. But even those who championed natural explanations could not fully dismiss the unease the disaster evoked. Letters from the period show a subtle tension. Scientists eager to assert reason, yet privately unsettled by the uncanny nature of the reports. Perhaps the most haunting detail is that some scientists recognized their own limitations. They admitted that glacial dynamics were poorly understood, that these outburst floods were unpredictable, and that no one could say when or why a glacier might suddenly release its fury. One German scholar remarked, "We may measure stones and chart rivers, but the glacier remains an enigma. It guards its secrets until the hour of their release." For survivors, this sounded less like science and more like prophecy. What science offered, then, was not comfort but a different kind of fear. To call the event a Jokerlorp gave it a name, but not a safeguard. It meant the villagers were not punished for sin nor cursed by spirits, but simply caught in the path of a natural machine that might erupt again without warning. Was that any less terrifying? To many, the scientific explanation felt colder, harsher, and less merciful than the religious one. At least divine punishment offered the chance of redemption. The glacier, in the scientific view, cared nothing for human lives. In the years that followed, Icelandic scholars tried to bridge the gap between local experience and scientific theory. They collected testimonies but couched them in cautious language, stripping away the supernatural and emphasizing measurable detail. Yet even these sanitized records carry shadows of the uncanny, mentions of light in the ice, of survivors describing the flood as if it chose its victims. Despite the scientific lens, the raw humanity of the event refused to vanish. Looking back, the glacier disaster of 1852 sits at a crossroads of understanding. It was a moment when science attempted to assert dominance over folklore, but found itself shaken by the power of human experience. Theories of geothermal heat, hidden lakes, and fractured ice gave partial answers, but they never erased the sense of presence survivors felt. Even in the language of geology, the glacier remained something more than frozen water. It remained a mystery, a force that could not be fully measured, only endured. And so, the explanations of scientists, though rational, did little to erase the fear that the glacier might act again, without warning, without reason, and with the same devastating power. In this way, science and superstition, though opposed, led to the same conclusion. The glacier was dangerous, unpredictable, and in its silence, it remained profoundly unsettling. When dawn broke over the valley after the night of the glacier's collapse, the scene was almost unrecognizable. Where once there had been homes, pastures, and winding paths between turf-roof cottages, there now lay only a wasteland of mud, broken timber, and scattered ice. Survivors who staggered out from higher ground or debris-choked shelters described the landscape as a battlefield, stripped of its life and covered in scars. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. For those who remained alive, survival was not relief. It was the beginning of another kind of torment. The immediate aftermath was consumed with desperate searches for the missing. Men and women clawed through the mud with their bare hands, digging until their fingers bled, calling names into the wreckage with voices that cracked and failed. In some cases, they uncovered bodies, waterlogged and twisted in unnatural ways. In others, they found nothing, only the suggestion of lives erased so completely that it was as though they had never existed. Some swore they could still hear voices beneath the ice, faint cries that faded the deeper they dug, until they had to stop for fear of going mad. The grief of survivors was compounded by guilt. Again and again, testimonies mentioned the same refrain: "Why me?" Parents who had lost their children wept openly and cursed their survival, saying the glacier had chosen wrongly. Men who had lived while their families were swept away refused to return to their farms, unable to bear the sight of empty fields. Children who had been pulled from the water by chance lived with nightmares, convinced they were meant to drown alongside their siblings. One priest recorded that many of those spared became shadows of themselves, wandering without purpose, as if their souls too had been carried away. This psychological devastation took many forms. Nightmares haunted nearly every survivor. They spoke of dreaming of rushing water, of hearing the same roar that had woken them that night. Some dreamed of faces staring at them through ice, repeating the same silent scream. Others refused to sleep indoors at all, fearing that if they closed their eyes beneath a roof, the glacier would strike again. Families moved into makeshift shelters on higher ground, preferring cold and hunger to the dread of returning to the valley floor. For many, the most lasting wound was the sense of being watched. Survivors said that even after the glacier returned to stillness, they felt its presence looming over them whenever they stepped outside. Farmers working in their ruined fields glanced constantly at the mountainside, as though expecting it to shift and send another wall of ice crashing down. Children pointed at the glacier at twilight, saying they saw figures standing on its edge, watching silently. Whether hallucinations born of trauma or something stranger, these impressions kept the fear alive long after the physical danger had passed. The community itself fractured under the weight of suspicion and interpretation. Some insisted the disaster had been divine punishment, and they demanded public confessions of sin, pushing guilt onto their neighbors. Others whispered of old pagan spirits and accused families of angering the Landvedi by breaking forgotten taboos. Arguments broke out in parish meetings. Grief turned into bitterness and blame. Instead of uniting in the face of tragedy, the survivors often found themselves isolated, each clinging to their own explanation. Materially, the losses were immense. Livestock drowned, fields were choked with mud, and grain stores had been destroyed. The already fragile subsistence economy of the region collapsed almost overnight. Some survivors fled entirely, abandoning the valley to seek new lives elsewhere in Iceland or across the sea. Those who remained were left in constant fear that another collapse might strike. Few rebuilt their homes in the same places. Ruins were left to sink back into the earth, as though to disturb them was to risk calling the glaciers wrath again. The psychological scars extended beyond the valley. News of the disaster spread across Iceland, carried in church records, letters, and traveling merchants' tales. In towns far away, people spoke of the glacier as though it were alive, as though it had chosen to kill. Parents frightened their children into obedience by reminding them of the faces in the ice, warning that disrespect for the land would call the glacier down upon them. In this way, the trauma of the survivors seeped into the collective memory of the nation. Priests and scholars attempted to provide comfort, but their words rarely matched the depth of the wound. To say it was God's will gave no solace to a mother staring at an empty cradle. To say it was natural geology offered no peace to a farmer who felt the glacier watching him from his fields. And so the survivors carried on in silence, bearing their scars privately, passing their unease into whispered stories at night. Some survivors were said to have never spoken of the event again. They withdrew from community life, working quietly, eating quietly, sleeping quietly, as though speaking might summon the flood back upon them. Others became compulsive storytellers, repeating their accounts endlessly to anyone who would listen, unable to release themselves from the grip of memory. Both extremes reveal the same truth. The glacier had not only killed bodies, it had broken minds. Generations later, descendants of the survivors still spoke of the event with unease. In family histories, the disaster was not a story told in detail but a shadow mentioned in passing, with warnings attached. Do not trust the stillness of ice, one grandmother told her children, for it hides what it means to do. These echoes ensured that the psychological scars never fully healed. In the end, the aftermath of the 1852 glacier disaster was not measured only in lives lost or farms destroyed, but in the deep, lingering wound it left on the human psyche. It was a wound that made survivors distrust the land, distrust silence, and even distrust their own memories. To them, the glacier was no longer a distant, silent neighbor. It was a killer, a presence, and perhaps worst of all, a reminder that safety is always an illusion. As the physical wreckage of the glacier disaster faded beneath grass and moss, something else remained: stories. Iceland has always been a land where nature and myth are intertwined, where every mountain, stream, and stone seems to carry a voice of its own. The survivors of the 1852 collapse and their descendants did not simply describe what had happened as an accident of ice and water. They wove it into the fabric of folklore, reshaping their trauma into tales of haunting, divine retribution, and restless spirits. In time, the glacier was no longer just a natural feature. It became a character in Icelandic legend, feared and respected like a living thing. The earliest stories that circulated after the disaster were whispered warnings. Children were told not to play too close to the glacier, because the ice remembers. Mothers would hush their little ones by saying that the spirits of the drowned wandered beneath the frozen surface, waiting to pull down anyone who dared to mock or disturb the mountain. Survivors swore they had seen ghostly faces in the walls of ice at twilight, the outlines of people they once knew, frozen mid-scream. Some insisted the glacier was not a mass of frozen water at all, but a prison, a transparent wall behind which the souls of the lost were trapped for eternity. Tales soon spread of voices that carried on the night wind. Farmers working in ruined fields after dark would pause, certain they had heard someone calling their name from the direction of the glacier. A shepherd once testified to hearing the bleating of sheep, even though his entire flock had perished in the flood. When he followed the sound, he claimed to see the faint silhouette of animals frozen within the ice, their legs moving as if still alive. Stories like these blurred the line between hallucination and haunting, between memory and myth. Priests tried to frame the disaster as an act of God's judgment, but the people clung to older beliefs as well. The Landvedi, the guardian spirits of Iceland, were said to have turned their faces away from the valley that night. According to one legend, the people had forgotten to honor the spirits properly during midsummer, and the collapse was their punishment. Another story claimed that trolls dwelling in the mountains had grown angry at the ringing of church bells echoing across the valley, and they had struck the glacier in their fury, sending it crashing down upon the settlement. In these tales, the collapse was not random. It was a consequence, a response to human arrogance or neglect. The most chilling folklore to arise from the disaster centered on the belief that the glacier was alive. Survivors often spoke of it as if it had chosen its victims, taking some while sparing others. Over the decades, this belief transformed into the idea that the glacier was a predator, one that fed not on animals but on human souls. It waits, one local saying warned, and it will wait longer than any man can live. Elders taught their grandchildren never to turn their backs on the glacier, because it watched with patient malice. To this day, there are those who will not face away from it when passing nearby, muttering protective prayers until they are safe beyond its shadow. Ghost stories multiplied in the years that followed. Travelers crossing the valley after nightfall claimed to see figures walking across the glacier's surface, men, women, and even children, moving in silence before vanishing into the mist. One tale told of a farmer who refused to leave the valley despite losing his family. Villagers said they saw him conversing with shapes at the edge of the glacier, his voice low and broken. When they finally confronted him, he insisted he was speaking with his wife and children, who lived within the ice, waiting. Not long afterward, he disappeared, and his body was never recovered. Some whispered that he had joined them, swallowed whole by the glacier's frozen mouth. Legends also transformed the disaster into a warning of future calamities. When the glacier groans, people said, it remembers. The cracking and shifting sounds that glacier naturally make became interpreted as voices, the glacier's mutterings of hunger, or its restless stirring before another strike. Parents warned their children that if they ever heard laughter within the sound of breaking ice, it meant the glacier was preparing to claim more lives. This folklore effectively turned natural phenomena into omens, embedding the memory of 1852 into every rumble and crack that echoed from the mountain. The haunted reputation of the glacier also attracted fascination from beyond the valley. By the early 20th century, writers, poets, and folklorists recorded the tales, blending survivor testimony with the supernatural. What began as whispered warnings in cottages became printed legends in books, ensuring the story would never fade. Tourists who visited the region were told about the faces in the ice, and some claimed to have captured strange shapes in photographs. Whether these were tricks of light or something more sinister, they fueled the belief that the glacier was not merely a monument of nature, but a haunted graveyard of ice. In the broader tapestry of Icelandic folklore, the 1852 disaster became one of many stories in which nature was not passive but active, dangerous, and vengeful. Just as volcanoes were believed to roar in anger and sea spirits to drown careless sailors, so too was the glacier seen as an unpredictable force with its own will. But unlike fire or ocean, the glacier's power was quiet, patient, and suffocating. It was not an enemy that struck often, but one that struck rarely and with devastating finality, leaving behind not just ruin, but an enduring sense of dread. Thus, long after the ice had stopped moving and the valley had returned to silence, the disaster lived on in story and superstition. To the people of Iceland, the glacier was no longer just frozen water. It was a haunted being, an eternal reminder of the thin boundary between life and death. Its legend became both a warning and a way of coping, a means of giving shape to trauma too immense to explain in ordinary words. By the dawn of the 20th century, the 1852 Glacier disaster had shifted from a raw wound to a dark mystery, one that historians, scientists, and eventually paranormal investigators would all attempt to unravel. What had truly happened that night in Iceland? Was it a freak of nature, or was there more to the tale than physics and ice? The pursuit of answers transformed the event into not just a story of local folklore, but a subject of scientific curiosity and a testing ground for modern theories about the dangers hidden within Glacier. Early geologists who visited the valley decades after the collapse noted how unusual the landscape appeared. Instead of the neat deposits of rock and sediment one might expect from a simple landslide, the terrain was scattered with strange debris fields, as if the glacier had not just broken but exploded. Boulders weighing several tons were flung far from their original resting places, carried by the sheer force of the icy deluge. These anomalies fascinated researchers, who began to suspect that something far more violent than melting or erosion had occurred. Theories of sudden ice-dammed floods, later known as geology, began to take shape, but even then, the size and suddenness of the disaster made it stand apart from ordinary cases. As the decades rolled on, scientists became increasingly interested in the hidden mechanics of Glacier. Iceland, with its volatile combination of ice and volcanic activity, became a natural laboratory. Researchers suggested that geothermal heat beneath the glacier might have rapidly melted enormous reservoirs of water, creating a catastrophic outburst. Others pointed to seismic activity, an earthquake that cracked the glacier and triggered its sudden collapse. These explanations offered naturalistic answers, but they could not erase the chilling testimony of survivors who described the disaster as if the glacier itself had struck with intent. The scientific community wrestled not only with the mechanics of the event, but with the weight of its mythic aura. By the mid-20th century, technology had advanced enough to allow more detailed study. Aerial photography and ground-penetrating surveys revealed hidden tunnels and caverns within the glacier, suggesting that entire rivers had once flowed through its heart. This discovery lent credibility to the theory that vast quantities of water had been trapped beneath the ice, waiting for the perfect moment to burst free. But to locals, these hidden rivers sounded eerily similar to the underground voices described in folklore. Where science saw water pressure and structural collapse, villagers saw evidence that their ancestors had been right. The glacier contained restless forces, unseen but always threatening. The overlap of folklore and science drew the attention of another group, paranormal researchers. In the 1970s and 80s, when interest in supernatural phenomena surged worldwide, the haunted reputation of the glacier became a subject of field studies. Investigators equipped with tape recorders, cameras, and thermal sensors ventured into the valley. Some reported strange electrical malfunctions near the glacier's edge. Others claimed to have captured faint voices on audio recordings, whispers in Icelandic, though no one had been speaking at the time. Photographs often showed odd distortions, streaks of light, translucent figures, or what appeared to be faces embedded in the ice. Skeptics dismissed these as pareidolia, tricks of the mind and camera, but the evidence was compelling enough to keep the legend alive in modern times. In recent years, climate change has added yet another layer of urgency to these investigations. As Iceland's glacier retreat, the scars of the 1852 disaster have been laid bare once more. Meltwater reveals buried remains, fragments of homes, rusted tools, even bones that were long thought lost to the flood. Each discovery reopens the story, turning the valley into both a historical archive and a macabre graveyard. Scientists studying the exposed terrain note how eerily preserved some artifacts remain, as if frozen in time since the night of the collapse. For local communities, these re-emergences feel like ghosts returning from the past, demanding to be remembered. Modern seismologists and glaciologists continue to monitor the region, wary of repeating history. Instruments measure the glacier's movements, while satellites track its retreat. The data confirms what folklore once warned: Glacier can hide enormous dangers, capable of sudden violence without warning. But for all the science that has been applied, something about the 1852 collapse resists tidy explanation. Why did it occur at that exact moment, with such overwhelming force? Why were some survivors convinced they heard voices and laughter in the ice? And why does the glacier continue to inspire such dread, even in an age of data and rationality? Ultimately, modern investigations into the glacier represent more than just geology. They embody the tension between science and story, between the measurable and the mysterious. On paper, the disaster can be explained as a jokelope, an outburst flood caused by hidden meltwater. Yet when researchers walk the valley, they admit the place feels different. The silence is heavy, the landscape unsettling, as if the ground itself remembers what happened. It is this combination, facts supported by instruments, layered with the intangible weight of history, that ensures the 1852 glacier collapse is never reduced to mere science. It remains, even today, a mystery that is both natural and supernatural, both studied and feared. The glacier story, then, is not just about ice. It is about how human beings confront the unknown. Scientists continue to measure, test, and hypothesize. Folklorists continue to record the stories that keep the memory alive. And paranormal enthusiasts still search for proof of restless spirits in the ice. Together, their efforts show that the glacier is not just frozen water, but a mirror, reflecting back our deepest fears, our hunger for answers, and our inability to ever truly separate fact from legend.